Hey, what's going on, DDO players? Axel here. So today we're going to talk about the Warpriest tree versus the Falconry tree. I'm going to give my opinions on which tree is better and explain in detail why. So after Warpriest got its pass, I spent quite a bit of time playing with Warpriest. So I took all the way up to tier 4, played with the enhancements for a while, the new incarnation of them. And since Falconry's been out for the past month or two, I've spent a bunch of time playing Falconry and playing with those enhancements. And these are the two main trees you might consider on first glance for a melee type cleric. But really, I think this video, this video really is mainly for clerics, but also favorite souls as well can get a lot from this, even though I'm going to focus on clerics mainly, because that's what I play. But I wanted to give my opinions on the tree. I had talked about this before in prior videos that I was going to do a video about this, just comparing the two. And I did do a video a couple weeks ago on the Falconry tree, just breaking that down. If you want to get all my in-depth thoughts on Falconry, you can check out that video. In this video, I'm not going to go through every enhancement one by one, but I'm going to skip through and just hit the important points and the important enhancements that I think really really tell the tale here of why, in my opinion, Falconry, spoilers, is a lot better than Warpriest, even after the pass. So let's kind of break this down. First, let's talk about melee clerics. So back in the day, I think for a long time, really until a couple updates ago, I think if you were going to go with melee cleric, strength based was the way to go because there was no whiz to hit and damage really in the game. There's some good synergy there with Divine Might and going Cha and splashing Paladin and all that. And I think now, when you compare strength and wisdom based, I think after we got a few changes, the Falconry tree, but not just the Falconry tree, I think that also the epic defensive fighting feat also made going strength based and splashing Paladin less worth it, just because you can get the competence bonus to hit points with epic defensive fighting that doesn't stack with Paladin. I'll get more into that in a little bit. But basically, these two changes made it, I think, shifted things. So where I think if you're going to build a melee cleric now, you definitely want to go wisdom-based Falconry. I think it's the way to go. I think that Falconry is definitely better than Warpriest, and I'm going to go through just various enhancements here and explain why. But when it comes to strength versus wisdom-based, let's talk about some of the other benefits you get from going wisdom. Because with wisdom you do have to invest in the Falconry tree, but you get some other things by going wisdom. Obviously you get extra SP spell points, which is great. I mean, not that critical, but it's a nice perk. And you also get some wisdom-based casting ability, which surprisingly is helpful. You can take something like Mass Frog and do some pretty good stuff with that. Like, for example, in Baba's Hut, I don't even have that high of a wisdom right now. Even without an insightful wisdom item equipped, I was still able to pretty easily insta-kill all the scarecrows and old Babas with Mass Frog on, I think we're running on hard, legendary hard, so that's good. So there are some uses for it, some casting uses for it. Mass Frog, I think, probably being the best, but also Implosion and stuff can be helpful at times. Now, you're not going to hit your DCs, aren't going to be as high as, say, if you were focusing on casting, just because if you're going to run a melee build, you're going to focus on equipping and taking feats for melee, so you're not going to be taking feats and using gear slots on getting your DCs higher. So there's some give and take there, as well as your twist slots for getting your DCs higher and things. But there is some use from that. You also lose Divine Might. Now, Divine Might in Warpriest is pretty nice, but it adds bonuses to strength based on your charisma modifier. So that's something, if you were strength based, you get that bonus, but it is an insightful bonus to strength, and you can get that in other ways, and it's just not that big of a loss, but we'll get more to that in a minute. And another thing with wisdom based, because if you go wisdom to hit and damage, because you're not using Divine Might, I think it makes less sense, as I mentioned before, to go with get a high charisma and invest in like a Pally Splash, because there's not as much synergy there if you're going to focus on wisdom to also build charisma, because charisma, as I've mentioned, has some other benefits to going strength based, because again, you use a charisma modifier to Divine Might. Okay, let's get to some of the, I guess, more notable enhancements. Again, I'm not going to go through every enhancement, but let's start with one of the cores here, Implacable Foe. Okay, Implacable Foe is the capstone to Warpriest, and I want to explain why I don't think it's a huge, it's a big loss. It's still not a great ability. What it does is basically it gives you for 18 seconds, and for an additional every time you refresh, you get an additional 3 seconds. But you get a plus 10% bonus to damage, and this has a 3-minute cooldown. So yeah, that's pretty good. It's not amazing just because it has a lot of downtime. When you're talking about Implacable Foe, you're talking about something with around a 30-second duration with a 3-minute cooldown. So you're talking about a 16% uptime. If you take 30 seconds divided by 3 minutes, you get something like that. You get around 16% uptime, which isn't amazing. Considering it's a capstone, you can only use it 16% of the time because the rest of the time it's going to be on cooldown, even if you hit it every 3 minutes when it goes off cooldown. The plus 10% damage in Implacable Foe is good, but it's not a huge loss because I think there's other things in Falconry that are much better than even Implacable Foe. I think that in tier 4, the Expose Weakness enhancement from Falconry, it gives minus 50% fort every time you land a bird attack, and with bird attacks. In particular, not coordinated strike, but strike for the eyes only has a 10-second cooldown, and this minus 50% fort bonus, it lasts for 10 seconds. So you can have 100% uptime. So basically, when you compare something like Implacable Foe, which is 16% uptime for 10% damage to you and your allies, or 100% uptime for something like Expose Weakness, which is minus 50% fort, which can be huge in a lot of areas, like if you're fighting undead, or if you ever say like a raid boss that has 100% fort, if you can reduce that 100% fort down to 50, that means so many more critical hits are hitting from your allies, and I think that alone is really I don't know, I would have to do the math, but I would say that that's probably like really comparable to even having a 10% damage boost, because so many more crits are hitting, especially in this meta. In this meta, everyone is building for crits for melee DPS. Like, everyone's building for crits. So if more crits are going to be able to hit, that's a big deal. So there's things in Falconry that outshine, I think, even the best enhancement in or the capstone enhancement in Warpriest. Again, you get 100% uptime for minus 50% fort compared to 16% uptime for 10% damage boost. And there's a lot of restrictions on that damage boost as well. Basically, you have to have the people around you. There's a refresh requirement for them to be near you. So overall, I think Exposed Weakness is better even than the capstone in Warpriest. So that's one solid reason to go Falconry. Just Exposed Weakness is really good. Okay, another thing in Warpriest, the Righteous Weapon line, it's just, I don't see how it's near worth the action points. It's still really high in the action point costs. And this is one of the core enhancements of the Warpriest tree, is getting this Righteous Weapon line. It's in every single tier, and it ends with Wrathful Weapons at tier 5. But if you just look at the first 4 ranks especially, you have to spend 8 AP, 8 action points for +4 to hit and damage with a weapon that has to be favored. And that's one of the other problems with Warpriest, is it relies on a favored weapon requirement, and a lot of the time these favored weapons really restrict you to weapons you don't want to use, and they're tied to race. So moreover, if you want to use like one of the better weapons, you will have to run a certain type of race, which is just a bummer. And it makes favored weapons just a lot weaker, the fact that they're tied to race. Maybe that'll change in the future. I know the developers have said they want to change that, but right now it sounds to me, just from reading developer posts, I would speculate that the tech is tied to race, so they can't do that right now. They'd have to kind of redo the coding of how this enhancement works. So, but nevertheless, I think that's kind of weak to be a core focus of the tree. It's just not enough reward there for your action points. Falconry, it honestly just has better enhancements overall. It's better in support, has better DPS, and I'll get into why. It has better weapon effects, better cores, better side perks, better crowd control. We'll get into all this in a minute, but I think Falconry just does pretty much everything that Warpriest does, but better. So except maybe healing, and we'll get into that in a minute. I don't think it's really a big deal. Well, we'll just talk about it now. The only thing of note Warpriest really has over Falconry is the healing element. It does have Ameliorating Strike, which is okay, but it's not essential. It does have Warpriest also has plus 10% double strike, double shot, which is awesome. But other enhancements in Falconry just make up for this and more. Like the cores in Falconry, for example, give bonuses to melee and range power, and a lot of the bird, actually, like I think all of the bird attacks make opponents helpless. And and in addition to that, you get extra damage to helpless. You get a up to plus 30% damage enhancement to helpless along the way, also in the tree. So that kind of far outweighs, in my opinion, the 10% double strike. Although you could probably say that as far as base damage goes, if you consider double strike without counting, well, in some ways you might say Warpriest has a better DPS, but I think practically Falconry is going to outshine Warpriest for sure in DPS. But let's go ahead and talk about Ameliorating Strike, because Ameliorating Strike is nice to have, but if we're talking Warpriest compared to Falconry, it's not necessary for clerics, because I've talked about this before, but Ameliorating Strike, it's nice to have, but I'm just not a big fan. I don't think it's essential, because when you look at it, it's essentially just a worse version of Radiant Burst, a much worse version. It is Radiant Burst, but with a bunch of restrictions. Ameliorating Strike has a 12-second cooldown, whereas Burst is 6. So that's obviously way better for Burst. But the biggest thing with Ameliorating Strike, and while it's nice to have, but it's not essential for a cleric who's going to be investing in Radiant Servant. And if you're running a cleric, you, in my opinion, should be investing in Radiant Servant, or why run a cleric? Why run a cleric if you're not going to focus on healing, or at least put a big emphasis of your character on healing? But with Ameliorating Strike, it doesn't work if you try to attack your opponent and miss. And I'm not referring to missing an attack roll, because if you're investing in your melee, that shouldn't ever happen really. But what I'm referring to is just trying to hit an enemy with Ameliorating Strike, and you're physically just a little bit out of range and you whiff. Nothing happens. You don't get the healing. You actually have to make contact and be in range of your opponent. The other problem with that is that you have to have the monster around. Whereas Burst can be used anytime, anywhere. You can use Burst as an oh crap, heal, as in, you are down to like 10% of your health because you got hit by some spike damage. You need to hit something quick to heal yourself. Burst can be used for that purpose, because it doesn't have a requirement that you have to be near an enemy. Enemies, with Ameliorating Strike, you have to hit the enemy, so you can't use it just running away. Whereas Burst, you can use it in any situation. You can run to a part of the map to heal allies where there's no monsters. You can just use it as an oh crap heal anytime you want. Whereas Ameliorating Strike, you can't do that. And it's nice to Ameliorating Strike is nice to have, and I played with it quite a bit when I was playing fast. Earlier, I guess it was more during the summer now when I was playing with Warpriest. I did use Ameliorating Strike for all those months just to test it out and just to see if there's something I missed with it. But it's really not necessary. You have so many other healing options as a cleric. You have Aura, Radiant Servant Aura, which you should take, in my opinion, or why run a cleric. That's how I feel. Radiant Servant Burst you're going to have. You can have your Mass Cures. You have Epic Destiny abilities you can twist in, like Renewal, Consecrated Ground. Of course, you have your heal spells. You have Mass Heal. You have Cure spells, etc. You just have so many options as a cleric. And then like Cocoon, if you want to twist that in as well. You have so many healing options as a cleric. It's not really a bonus to Warpriest to get a little extra healing from Ameliorating Strike, just because you have so many options anyway, so you don't need it. It's not necessary. I think Ameliorating Strike is more helpful if you're maybe building like maybe a cleric splash or something, and you want to take it just to get a little extra healing. Although there's probably better ways to do that with pretty much any other build, just because Ameliorating Strike is tier 4, requiring a 10 action point investment. You might want to actually even just invest in Radiant Servant instead if you take to get Burst, if you're going to go with Splashing Cleric for a little bit of healing ability, because Burst is actually core 3 and it requires only a 10 AP investment. So Radiant Servant Burst actually requires half the action points of Ameliorating Strike. So that's another big plus for Radiant Servant Burst. So, that's just my whole spiel. I guess I haven't given it in a few years, just my whole spiel as to why Ameliorating Strike is just not necessary, and it's just not worth it because, again, if you're playing a cleric, you have to take Radiant Servant, or why play a cleric? If you're ignoring your healing on a class that the only thing it does better than any other class is heal, like why would you play that class? Like if you want to melee, just play a regular. If you want to melee but not focus on healing, just play a regular melee class. Or if you want to cast and not focus on healing, why play cleric? Play a different caster class that's better at offensive damage or crowd control. Play a wizard, play a warlock, whatever. Okay, let's move on to talking about the bird attacks. The bird attacks are just really good, much better compared to the attacks available in Warpriest. So Warpriest has Silence of the Wicked, which is a +3 damage attack that prevents spellcasting for 4 seconds. But if you compare that to what's available in the Falconry bird attacks, the bird attacks are just straight up way better versions of this. Instead of getting 4 seconds of preventing spellcasting, all of the bird attacks straight up make mobs helpless and straight up blind them and cause big reductions in their fortification as well once you take exposed weakness. 4 seconds from not being able to cast is kind of great, but that also means it doesn't do anything to melee mobs, right? So it's not really that great. Then you look at an attack like Radiant Flourish, which is also in Warpriest, which is 3 action points for a +3 weapon damage attack with 3d6 light damage, and it has a small chance of being blinded. But again, other attacks like in Falconry, like I think Coordinated Strike and Blind Strike for the Eyes, they just straight up make mobs helpless. Instead of dealing with a small chance of being blinded, like you can take these attacks and they always make mobs blinded unless the mobs make their save, which in case you still have them be slow. They are actually slowed for 30% for 10 seconds, even if they make their save. So you could even argue that being slowed for 30% for 10 seconds is pretty equivalent to being blinded, considering the blind effect on Radiant Flourish is only a small chance of being blinded, whereas at least you get them to be slowed by 30 seconds for 10 seconds every single time. So, it's just not comparable. The bird attacks are way better, especially when you talk about stuff like, Strike for the Eyes only has a 10-second cooldown, and then of course, and you have Coordinated Strike in Falconry, which is a CC attack, so it's an area of effect. Whereas these attacks in Warpriest are not; they're just single attacks. So yeah, the bird attacks just straight up are way better than the attacks available in Warpriest. This, as I've kind of mentioned before, the next point I wanted to make is that the crowd control in Falconry is just a lot better. There is some in Warpriest, such as Magical Backlash. Now, Magical Backlash in Warpriest, I do like. I think it's pretty nice. It's a 30%. It's a passive effect, and it's 30% chance to make any mobs get knocked down when they hit you with a spell, and there's no save for it, which is pretty nice in some caster-heavy dungeons. But again, this obviously pales in comparison to the Falconry CC attacks, crowd control attacks, the bird attacks that will always make mobs helpless, assuming that you have the DC there for them to not make their save, and they always give minus 50% fortification. And even if they don't make their save, they at least slow them for a little bit. So it's just way better than the Magical Backlash attack, which I do like Magical Backlash though. I think it's good, but it's just the Falconry are just better. And then the other thing with Magical Backlash is it only affects the mobs when they hit you with a spell. So again, it doesn't do anything to melee mobs. Okay, let's talk about the next point. There's just a lot of things. I think Warpriest really struggles to define a build that benefits from it. Like I can't honestly think of any cleric build that would do better in Warpriest than in say anything in even Falconry, or especially one of the design goals was to make Warpriest more defensive focused and make War Soul more offensive focused. And one thing they gave Warpriest, for example, was in Tier 5, while wearing heavy armor, you gain +10 PRR, +10 MRR, +10 AC, and +50% to threat generation. Now, this isn't really that relevant because I don't think any cleric should take Tier 5 in anything except for Radiant Servant, just my opinion. I'll explain that probably a little more in a bit. But if you wanted to make a tanking cleric, for example, and the point I'm trying to make, if you want to make a tanking cleric, you're far better off splashing paladin. Like these things that you get in tier 5 plus 5 plus 10 PRR, MRR, AC, and plus 50% threat gen. If you want to splash paladin, and even if you just go like to tier 2 and take like 2 levels of paladin, even if you only want to take 2 and you want to go to tier 2 Sacred Defender stance, you can get two of these options that I'm showing on the screen, which is 150% Sacred bonus to melee threat generation, plus 15% PRR and MRR, which kind of already outshines a bunch of the enhancements there. And on top of that, if you want to go tier 3, you can take all 3 of these bonuses, and then you also get in tier 3 paladin, if you want to take 3 paladin levels, you also get the plus 20% competence bonus to maximum hit points, which obviously you're not getting in Warpriest. Now you can get you can use the competence bonus to hit points from epic defensive fighting, which is a plus 25% bonus, which does not stack with the Sacred Defender stance, but the bonus with the Sacred Defender stance is you can use that while you're casting, whereas you can't really do that with Epic Defensive Fighting because it has major problem. It has basically makes it so you can hardly use your healing spells or buffing spells because it dramatically cuts down your range. Yeah, so that's another thing. Like I don't really see a build that works in Warpriest, like why you would take it over Falconry, or why you would take it if you really, really, really want to do a tanking cleric. Like seriously, just splash paladin. I don't really understand why you would go for this tier 5. And again, if you wanted to make, let's even say you wanted to make a build where you wanted to make a cleric that kind of just healed on the side and kind of focused on DPS. Say you wanted to take mostly all Warpriest, not really take much of Radiant Servant. The problem with that is why play cleric at that point? Again, I've mentioned this before, but like if you don't focus on healing and you don't take Radiant Servant tier 5 for aura, and so you're really a viable healer, which I do think you need aura to be a viable healer, just my opinion. Like viable main party healers, what I'm referring to. Like why wouldn't you just play a paladin or play some other melee class and just splash epic dusting abilities? If you want to just create a character that just kind of secondary heals, you could do that with tons of classes. All you have to do is just maybe take an epic destiny like Divine Crusader, so you can use Consecrated Ground for healing, and you can also twist in tons of epic destiny abilities to even really to get a secondary healing ability, secondary party healer on almost any class, because you can twist in stuff like Cocoon and Renewal and whatever else and do quite well, just being a backup healer with another class. Again, I think I mentioned this before, but I think another build possibility would be to take Wisdom to hit and damage in Falconry and also take Warpriest stuff if you wanted to build a build like that. But again, this goes back to I keep repeating myself, but it goes down to, again, why would you do that? Because why would you play cleric at that point? And also, why would you do that? Because why would you put those points in Warpriest? Because the Falconry enhancements are just better. Especially now, I'm not really the first 2 tiers. I think the first 2 tiers of Warpriest are pretty equivalent to Falconry, but it's just when you look at tier 3 and 4 Falconry compared to tier 3 and 4 Warpriest, that's the point I think Falconry really, really, really starts to strongly overshadow Warpriest. But I think going back to kind of the healing and playing a cleric, I think the way the meta has evolved these days with Reaper, and I've run these builds, at least the Falconry, I've run it up to Reaper. I've run some in Reaper 5, Reaper. I haven't run it in like Reaper 10 or anything, but I have run it in like the mid Reapers, like Reaper 5 and stuff. And I think it is viable, but you need to. But when you go into Reaper mode, and this is the reason you really need to focus on healing on a cleric, is because when you're in Reaper as a melee cleric, you are much more of a healer than you are a melee character, because the way it plays, and Falconry just complements playing a melee cleric in Reaper so much better than Warpriest does, because The way you got to play, at least in my opinion, from my experiences in Reaper as a melee cleric, and I know a lot of people say melee cleric isn't viable in Reaper. I do think it is, but the way you have to play it is you're a healer first, and you have to kind of nudge and with experience kind of judge how much damage you can take, and you've got to judge how if you can afford to be on the front line or not. And a lot of the time that means that you want to let, say, a more durable class like a tank in Reaper take the aggro, and then you kind of come from behind and you hit it with your melee from there. But you're going to focus, I think, a lot more as a melee cleric and Reaper on doing, instead of doing like cleaves and massive AoE damage and stuff, you're going to focus on a lot more on single target, because that's what you can do safely. And what complements that? Well, Falconry complements that, because what you can do is, say your tank has the aggro and say a DPS melee is DPSing it beside the tank, you can run up there as well while the tank has the aggro and start hitting it with your Falconry attacks. And it really complements both the melee, the straight up DPS melees and your tank melee, because what it does is you hit it and you can hit it every 10 seconds with a bird attack like Strike for the Eyes, and you can give whatever it is they're attacking, like a mini boss or the quest boss or raid boss or whatever, you can constantly hit it with minus 50% fortification. And that's a huge benefit in Reaper to the other melees, because they're going to get a lot more crits in, and it really helps the party DPS. So you can, with Falconry, you can have a really good role as a melee cleric, not doing main DPS, but doing support DPS that focuses on debuffing enemies with exposed weakness to get the fortification down of enemies, so that other classes can get their more critical hits in addition to using your Falconry attacks to make mobs helpless, so that everyone can benefit from the extra damage from a mob being helpless. So you do really good support DPS, and that's kind of how you got to play it in Reaper, in my opinion. You got to heal first, but they kind of run in and out of melee as you can afford to apply these debuffs with the Falconry attacks. So that works way better. So Falconry works way better in Reaper. Whereas if you try to play a Warpriest in Reaper, I don't think it's really viable, because the debuffs are just so much better with Falconry, and it's just like, why? Like there's not enough there to play. There's not enough benefits there to play support DPS or debuffing DPS, whatever you want to call it, with a melee cleric with Warpriest, because the only things you're hitting it with that really debuff. Now there is some enhancements in Warpriest that can cause enemies to take more damage over time, but it's just not as good. And there's other things like the Warpriest attacks that cause like enemies to not be able to cast for 4 seconds, but it's just not as good as the Falconry attack. So I think Falconry is just way better in Reaper. And then again, the main thing that Warpriest does in terms of healing is Ameliorating Strike, and I don't think it's good at all in Reaper, because you just can't be, like in Reaper, mobs hit too hard. You just cannot be running up to mobs with your melee cleric, because they're going to die, and then you're going to die, and then everyone else is going to die because they're relying on you to heal them. So you just can't, you got to be really, really safe, and that means you're not going to be up in monsters' faces too much. So if you're not going to be up in monsters' faces too much in Reaper, Ameliorating Strike is going to be a worse enhancement as a result. Okay, so enough of that. Let's see. What else do I have to say? I think actually, the other thing I want to point out, I think this is going to be the last thing. Let's talk about Warpriest Core 5 Warcaster. With this enhancement, Haste now grants a +1 competence bonus to critical threat range with your favored weapon, in addition to its other benefits. So this seems like a strong point for Warpriest, but it actually doesn't matter. Because why doesn't it matter? Because it seems like you look at this and be like, oh my gosh, Warpriest Core 5 gives a critical +1 competence, +1 critical threat range. Oh my gosh, we got to take this. But it actually doesn't matter, because it's a competence bonus in Warpriest Core 5, and that does not stack with Holy Sword. And Holy Sword is available for all clerics in War Domain. And not only does it not stack, but Holy Sword not only gives a +1 competence bonus to critical threat range, it also, unlike this Warpriest Core 5, also gives a +1 competence bonus to critical threat multiplier in addition to range. So Holy Sword gives +1 competence bonus to both critical threat range and multiplier, whereas this only gives it to only gives us to critical threat range. So obviously Holy Sword's a lot better. In this Warpriest Core 5 doesn't stack. In addition to that, this is also tied to favored weapons, so that's another drawback. But the main thing that matters is that this doesn't stack with War Domain's Holy Sword, and you're going to want to take War Domain if you're playing a melee cleric. It's the best option. Because even if you were going to take this enhancement for some reason, which you shouldn't, I don't think should go this high in Warpriest, you would still want to take Holy Sword to get the +1 to critical threat multiplier. I mean, that's still a really good DPS bonus there. And you want good, you do want Holy Sword, because you're going to want good, want good melee DPS, and you can get pretty good melee DPS with a Falconry build on a melee cleric if you take the right feats. And that really helps when it comes to boss fights, because again, the main thing you're really going to be focused on when it comes especially to the harder content, and especially with your Falconry, is single target debuffing and single target DPS. So you can really help in the DPS department. Now, you're not going to outshine any of the true melee classes in DPS, but you can provide some solid, not bad at all, melee DPS on these type of builds, and it can be really helpful, especially in boss fights. And again, you always benefit as a melee cleric from being up close with healing people with bursts and aura and such at the same time as you're kind of meleeing, providing that debuffing and providing that backup secondary DPS. So yeah, so overall, generally, as I've kind of mentioned, just I guess to summarize everything, and again, I could talk more, I could go over every single enhancement, but I just didn't feel that was necessary, because I've kind of given my full thoughts on both Falconry and Warpriest already. I'll put a link in the description. I did a full video on my thoughts on the Warpriest tree and the Warpriest changes specifically recently, and I also did a full video on Falconry, and I went through all the enhancement changes on the Warpriest video from the past, and I went through every single enhancement in the Falconry video. So if you want to get more details in more of my opinions on every single enhancement individually, then check out those videos. But generally, just to summarize everything up in this video, Falconry I think is just better from my experiences, and in my opinion, Falconry is just better. Falconry is just better in almost every way. Again, I think it provides better practical DPS because again, you maybe don't have the double strike and the plus damage from the Righteous Weapon line and Warpriest, but in practicality, from the ability to make mobs helpless with the Falconry attacks, the -50% fort, that's going to help you out, and also the additional helpless damage that's available in Falconry, in addition to the melee power, it more than offsets that, especially in practice when it comes to making mobs helpless. So the DPS in Falconry is better. The CC, crowd control, is definitely better from the Falconry attacks, making mobs helpless and blinding them and stuff. And the debuffing is better because, again, the -50% fort. And, so the really only thing that Warpriest, I think, has over that, besides having pretty equivalent, I think, Tier 1 and Tier 2 enhancements to Falconry, is the healing aspect with Ameliorating Strike. But again, it's not you don't need it, as I've explained already in this video. So yeah, if you're going to build a melee cleric, I think that as of now, in my opinion, definitely the way to go is to go Falconry with plus wisdom to hit and plus wisdom to damage, and just go basically Tier 4 Falconry and then go Tier 5 Radiant Servant and spend a few points here and there and like Human for Heal Lamp. So that's basically the way I think is the best way to run a melee cleric these days. So yeah, guys, that's my opinion. All my opinions on this. Again, it's just my opinion. So if you disagree, that's totally fine. It's just one person's opinion. It's just my opinion from my experiences. And if you disagree on anything, please post it below. I'm always very willing to listen to critical feedback or positive feedback or whatever you want. I always read the comments. So yeah, as many comments as I can, definitely. Usually all of them. So yeah, guys, yeah, that's going to be it for this video. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you found this video helpful. I will see you next time. Have a good one. Take care.